So, last we left off on, what was that? Well, I guess Tuesday. We finished up with, we hit up on the Allied invasion, Normandy. We discussed how the 101st dropped behind the landings. We compared and looked at the tactics of that and discussed why that was a big deal. Then we covered that eventually the Allies liberate France, and the Allies then become the armies of Free France, Great Britain, its Commonwealth nations of Canada and Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. In Europe, it's mainly Canada, United Kingdom, France, and the United States. And eventually, after they liberate France, they get the idea that they should go through the Benelux countries and try to invade Holland. And that's Operation Market Garden with Monty, where he dropped the airborne and tried to make a corridor for his tanks to go through, and it failed. End up in a stalemate, and winter hits. And this is where Hitler makes his last major offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, in the winter of 1944. In the Ardennes Forest, same location we've been discussing for the last two world wars. He hoped to take the port of Antwerp and cut off the forward British and Canadian units in Belgium. It didn't work out. He ends up getting stopped. Then we find ourselves after the Battle of Bulge pushing into Germany while the Soviets advance from the east, and the British and the United States advance from the west. The Soviets end up reaching Berlin on the 1st of April, or they end up reaching Berlin first in April 20th, and they surround Berlin, cut off and surround the 9th Army, and the 12th Army is cut in between the Allies and the Soviet Union. And that's where yesterday you would have looked at how the 9th Army could have went in and tried to save Berlin, but it was futile. That's what Hitler wanted. He also wanted the 12th to do the same. Instead, the 12th elected to make a corridor of safety for the 9th to escape, and that they all wanted to surrender to the Allies because of our treatment of POWs as the Allies was way better than what the Axis powers were doing. Truthfully, this is the first war in world history that the losers kill more people than the winners. Typically speaking, in wars prior to this, World War I and every war prior, the winner of the war was the person who could kill more of the enemy. And that was supposed to be how war was fought. In this war, however, we see that turned on its head, and the losers are sore losers. And during their time in this battle, they kill civilians en masse and end up that the losers kill 85% more people than what the winners do. And Stalin, being the common term, and the number of people that die under Stalin's rule is not really figured into that as well as it should be, but that's really what happens. So here at the end of it all for Germany and Italy and Europe, Hitler kills himself in his bunker on April 30th. He swallows a cyanide pill, has Eva Braun, his longtime girlfriend, swallow one. They got married the day before on April 29th or 28th or something like that. And his birthday happens to be right around in April too. And they both swallow these pills, and I think she just dies from the pill, if I'm not mistaken. And he ends up shooting himself in the head with the instruction of one of his closest new aides to take their bodies outside into a slit trench and pour petrol on it and burn them. And this is also that his body and his death can't be used as propaganda from the Soviet Union. And that's it. The Soviet Union, you can look at this bottom picture in the bottom left of the slide. they end up capturing what the building that's there is the Chancellery. That is the Capitol building there in Berlin. I need to switch which way these are going. Hold on, give me a minute. I'm sorry. There we go. So yeah, this is the Chancellery, is basically the Capitol building of Germany, and in that courtyard of the Chancellery is where Hitler's bunker was located. And this picture is actually the doctored picture. So the original photo is a much smaller Soviet Union flag that this soldier is taking here, putting up here. They then wished to redo the photo with a bigger flag, as you see here, and there was some things in the background that they removed. So they photoshopped it basically and added in a larger flag and removed the stuff. But this is the photoshopped one. I don't have a real one, but I just thought I'd let you know that. It's pretty interesting. So yeah, that's the end of Europe. Now let's talk about the place we didn't talk about much in class. And that's not because it's at all boring or anything. It's because it's very U.S.-centric. At the end of the day, Great Britain does play a role in the Pacific, but their role is really a losing role. Their Pacific fleet ends up getting destroyed. They end up losing a lot of their major colonial acquisitions. Free France just straight up gives up, and the French Indochina is just handed to the Japanese. And here, the United States is in the Pacific, anyways. The sole person really fighting them. They have the aid of the Australian. I don't want to discount the Australians and the New Zealanders. They're there too. They're fighting right alongside in their capacity, so that's true. Truly, though, most of the fighting takes place in China. So there's 7 million Japanese soldiers in China, while there's less than 1 million that are fighting out on the islands that are lost. We discussed this picture actually in the bottom left. That's the exact picture that was in the poster in the classroom. That's the rape of Nanking, or Nanjing. It's Nanjing. That's the capital, the imperial capital, and all of the things there in that trench next to that man are bodies. And basically the Japanese are just told, have at it, guys. You've been fighting hard. Here, take your aggression out on these people in this city. And thousands of years of hatred towards the Chinese is exerted out right here. 500-something thousand people, I believe, die, non-combatants in Nanking. And it's not the only place. It's several places that this occurs. They do this because the Japanese believe themselves superior to the other Asian races, as well as the other races of the world. It's that same nationalistic sympathy that is shown by the Nazis and how they are doing things. So they considered themselves yet another master race. And they're also, because of their imperial wanes, their growth that they're trying to do, they need natural resources. In particular, they're looking for oil, rubber, and aluminum. And all these things can be found in the coastal areas of what's called the Gangji Click, which is a southern province of China. And they can also get them in Borneo, which has got a lot of rubber. Borneo is part of Indonesia. It's a big island. And so they begin to conquer and get these natural resources before the war even starts. But there's a problem. And that is that the Philippines is located smack dab in the middle of all the islands and chunks of China that they wish to have. And there's not really any natural resource in the Philippines that they need. It's just that the land is owned by the United States, and it's basically like a knife in their back, just waiting to be used. And they deem this as a threat, and they deem the United States Navy as a threat. So, because of their dependency on raw resources that are located in all these areas, and the narrative is that they're dependent on our oil and that we give an oil embargo, and that's why they attack us. It's true. They were going to get their own oil, though. It's just south of the Philippines. And so, strategically, they need to take the United States out and secure the Philippines in order to get the oil to the south. Because at no point is attacking the United States going to get them oil, right? If we're embargoing the oil and they attack us, it doesn't make us give them oil. So it's sort of a misnomer that I've heard people say that, like, oh, the United States issues an embargo on oil, so Japan decides to attack us. It's not the whole truth. The side there is that Japan needs to get the Philippines under control so they can get to the oil to the south. So a guy by the name of Yamamoto, who is the admiral, or the head admiral of the Imperial Japanese Navy, he devises a plan that he puts forth to Tojo, who is basically the de facto leader of Japan, and basically comes up with a way that he can knock the American fleet, the United States fleet, out in one single decisive battle, and that is Pearl Harbor. So on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese carriers, I think there are 3 involved in this and 6 total, like the Soryu and the Aju. I can't remember all of them. They launch an aerial attack from the northern part of the island and fly in with modified torpedoes and dive bombers, and have practiced and worked this thing out to a T. And they attack on a Sunday, knowing that the majority of the ships would be in harbor during December, which most of the sailors are getting ready to go on holiday leave at this point. So ships are in the harbor, they're all lined up, and everybody's at church, basically. And they know this because they've got people there that have been spying on this and giving them intel the entire time. And the attack goes off basically without a hitch. They get done what they need to get done. They don't get the U.S. aircraft carriers who are out to sea, which most people would say is the biggest mistake of Pearl Harbor, and that's agreeable. Just remember, though, that the doctrine of utilizing an aircraft carrier as your primary means of attack is actually not there. Even though the Japanese are part of the pioneering movement that the aircraft carrier is the center of a fleet, that isn't the case in World War I or in the interwar period in between, and even at the start of World War II. It's Great Britain who shows that the aircraft carrier and these dive bombers and these torpedo bombers can be a suitable adversary for a ship and take out capital ships, which are the big guys. So those are your big battleships. That's what everybody thinks is the main bread and butter front line, if you will, of the fleet is the battleship. So when the Japanese do Pearl Harbor and they sink several battleships, they disable several battleships, it's a big deal. It is a very, very, very big deal. The Oklahoma, the Missouri, all of them, or Arizona. I don't remember which one is the one down here at the bottom right is. So this is the one that sank. I always get them backwards because one of them. So it's the Arizona or the Missouri. One of them is the battleship that sinks and starts the war, and the other one is the one that Japan signs their peace treaty on and ends the war. I'm drawing a blank as to which one's which. Anyways, so it's a success in their eyes. On the 8th, the day after, FDR goes before Congress, and he has to declare war. He puts out a declaration of war and says that this is a day that shall live in infamy. Everybody knows that line. By the 11th, the United States is at war with the Axis nations as well, because Germany, in its partnership with Japan, hears that Japan has basically declared war on the United States, and Hitler then declares war on the United States. And this is where a policy begins between Churchill and FDR that Germany first. They're going to focus on Europe first before they focus on Japan. The primary force that's going to be fighting in the Pacific isn't the Marine Corps, though. Most people think it is. It's actually still the Army under Douglas MacArthur, who's the Supreme Allied Commander in the Pacific, versus Eisenhower as the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. So Douglas MacArthur was stationed in the Philippines as they were attacked by Japan. He is forced out of retreat, and he vows to come back and one day liberate the Philippines. Underneath him is working a guy by the name of Admiral Nimitz, who's in charge of the U.S. Navy. And under them, under the United States Navy, is the United States Marine Corps. So MacArthur is named that Supreme Allied Commander, Southwest Pacific, in 1942, in the spring of 42. And we're starting to get our stuff together because we were losing from December 41 to March of 42. We lose several islands and decisive battles and things like that. Things aren't going well. And it's labeled here as a Japanese blitzkrieg. Okay, yeah, it's a combined arms movement, sure. And they embark on a campaign to conquer as much of Asia as possible. They get Guam, Hong Kong, the Philippines. Hong Kong was held by the British, and the Japanese got that right off the bat. Guam was one of our islands. It was taken. The Philippines, they also go for several other island chains south of Australia. And they do this virtually unchecked. They take Singapore, which is a major port down, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but in this picture in the bottom left, the Dutch East Indies is there, and there's a place called the Malacca Strait that goes into the Indian Ocean in between the South China Sea. Very key place today. Singapore is located right there at the tip of the Indonesian, or the tip, I guess this would be Thailand and modern-day Thailand peninsula. But Singapore is located there, and they take that from the British via the land, and the British didn't see that coming. It's a crazy moment. And so they start their own island hopping campaign and attack and conquer, and then move on to another one. By June of 44, the Allies began bombing raids on Japan. These are called the Doolittle raids, where, well, that's way later. Doolittle raids happened in 42 and 43. We actually started bombing Tokyo pretty quick, but we did it like basically just throwing away these bombers. They'd be stripped down to nothing but bombs, machine guns and all, taken off of them. Take off from an aircraft carrier, bomb Tokyo, and then they would ditch in China. That was the Doolittle raids. But by 44, we had taken islands back as we do our own island hopping campaign. And we get islands closer and closer in the Caroline Islands and the Mariana Islands. And eventually we're close enough that we can send off our Bell bombers, our B-19s and whatnot, made here, right here in Atlanta, in Marietta, and send them and start bombing Japan. Our famous battles that occur in the Pacific are the islands of Iwo Jima, which all of these islands are volcanic islands, and they're barren almost. I mean, there's jungle there, but the majority of the fighting is in this like barren wasteland, like you see here with these two Marines here. And the Japanese retreat into these volcanic caves and fortifications that they built in there. So we can shell and bomb the island all we want, but they're protected in their caves, and we have to clear them out one by one, and it's miserable. By the time we get to Okinawa, which is this island just south of Japan, I mean, we're right there. It's the end of the line for Japan. Their entire fleet has been wiped out. From Midway, the Battle of Midway, the Battle of Guadalcanal. The U.S. Navy has used its intelligence, its better technology. We also had a better system of running our ships, and we've beaten back the Japanese Navy to where now it's just a bunch of hulking pieces of steel in the harbors around Japan. We also have taken control of the Japanese skies and basically killed their air force, and now American planes just fly over Japan free. At this point, Japan freaks out and they start taking their pilots and training new pilots as fast as possible and crashing their aircraft into U.S. ships trying to halt the advance. And this is the rise of the kamikaze. Kamikaze references that it's a point of dying in the service of the emperor, which is what Banzai means. It means for the emperor. And the emperor is revered as a god in Japan. He is part of the Shinto religion, and the people there would do anything for him. So in the preservation of the emperor, the Japanese embark on this kamikaze policy and train pilots up as fast as possible, put them in a plane, fill it full of fuel, and begin flying them into the side of U.S. ships. And it's pretty successful. For one aircraft to take out a ship is something. But you only have so many pilots, and we have a lot of ships. Well, 1945, the Allies issue an ultimatum of peace to Japan, and Japan refuses to agree to an unconditional surrender. I'd like to note at this point that Japan is still holding its holdings in China, mainland Japan, and most of its surrounding islands. And an invasion is seen as too risky. An extensive loss of life, somewhere around 1 million troops are suspected to be lost in an initial invasion of the mainland Japan. And there's a desire and wish for the American public to end the war quickly as the war in Europe is over. Well, Truman is looking at things. Something happens as the Soviet Union begins to invade Manchuria. And they've been in a non-aggression system with Japan this entire war, where they haven't had to fight Japan, and Japan hasn't been fighting them, because the Soviet Union's been focused on Hitler. Well, once that's all done, Stalin turns his attention towards Manchuria and its southern, his southern part of the eastern part of Russia, but the southern flank. That's what I'm trying to say. And he invades Manchuria and starts to try to take as much territory as he can before the Japanese surrender. And this freaks out the Emperor and Tojo. They don't want to end up under Soviet control. They want to be under U.S. control, just like the POWs in Europe. And so this is the thing. You can ask yourself, when Truman made the decision to drop the bomb because he wanted to preserve American life and not invade Japan, is he intimidating the Soviets? Is he doing it to convince Japan to surrender? Or were the Japanese going to surrender anyways because they didn't want to fall under any Soviet control? Like, what was the motive to dropping? What did it accomplish? It's a question that historians are arguing to this day, and will probably argue from now on. Because, the Emperor, according to what we know, the Emperor wasn't wishing to surrender at first. And it wasn't until the invasion of the Soviet Union into Manchuria and the loss of some 1.5 million troops to either being captured or killed that he saw the writing on the wall. But that occurs before the drop of the atomic bomb. So it's just this thing. Well, and you look here, we drop one in Hiroshima and nothing out of the Imperial headquarters, right? And I'd like to note too that we've been doing what's called firebombing. We've been dropping these bombs that light these bamboo and primarily wood buildings in Japan on fire and just completely decimate entire cities. We'd already been doing that. The loss of life from the firebombs outweighs the loss of life at Hiroshima. So, okay, but then we drop another one 3 days later in Nagasaki and 2,000 people die. And suddenly, here's Japan. And the Emperor himself doesn't actually do the surrendering. It ends up that an envoy, just as in Germany, same thing. An envoy is sent out. They get on this battleship, the Missouri. I think I have it now. I'm pretty sure it's the Missouri. Watch me get it backwards. And they sign a peace accord. And it is a complete surrender. And it's on September 2nd, 1945. And if you look, the war started on September 1st, 1939. So 6 years and 1 day later, we're ending the war. And this is Victory over Japan Day, or VJ Day. Eventually, Douglas MacArthur flies a plane. They land in an airport in Japan. And they're escorted and taken in to the Imperial City in Kyoto, where they're going to go to the Imperial Palace, and he's going to meet the Emperor. And it's now MacArthur's job to decide if the Emperor is to be tried for war crimes, who's to be tried for war crimes, that kind of thing. it ends up he decides that the emperor is necessary to maintain peace in Japan, and now we still have the emperor today. His line is actually in danger, though. It's a male lineage that stretches back 1,000 years, like long time. Longest male lineage in the world history, and it's the only surviving one. And right now, it is up to like an 11 or 12-year-old boy to maintain that male lineage, and he's the only hope for it. If something happens to him, it ends 1,000 years. That's just something. So if we look at the total end-up cost of this war, let me go backwards. Total military and civilian debt is somewhere in the number of 60 million. Some even have it at like 75 million. The Soviet Union gets the worst of these casualties due to mismanagement and being the bulk of the force that is fighting Germany during Barbarossa. Some $4 trillion are spent. The Yalta and Potsdam conferences are done, and the Axis nations lose all of their additional territory and their main territory, and they're all occupied. Germany's divided into 4 zones, later split into 2 countries, East and West Germany. West Germany is the Allies, East Germany is the Soviet Union, and this East and West German bloc is what they're called, is maintained well up into, I think into the 90s. And into the 90s, because the Berlin Wall doesn't come down until 1990. So, it becomes the dominating factor of Europe from now on. And this Iron Curtain that you guys had mentioned in class, the Iron Curtain that descends upon Europe, goes through the middle of Germany. It's a metaphorical Iron Curtain. The only place that there is a wall that occurs is in Berlin. Everywhere else, it's like a fence and very heavily guarded border. And Berlin's in East Germany, by the way, but it's split up between the Allies and Axis powers because it's the de facto capital of Germany. It ends up Frankfurt, which is in West Germany, ends up becoming the new capital of West Germany. And today, if you were to look at Germany, East Germany is poor and still not doing so hot. Whereas West Germany is where the powerhouse of Germany is located, because that's where all the money that the United States funds back into Germany to build it up so it can resist the Soviet Union. It all is located in West Germany. So the United States decide that in order to oppose the Soviet Union influence, that they need to rebuild Europe. They develop what's called the Marshall Plan. Thurgood Marshall is the chief of staff of the United States Army at the time during the whole war. He's the boss of Eisenhower. He's the one who writes this plan. The Soviet Union, their policy, it's not that they refused per se, but their policy in Europe wasn't to build it up. Theirs was to strip it clean. So Eastern Germany and Poland and the Czech Republic and Slovakia, all the Bulgaria, Romania, all of them turn into these Eastern Bloc buffer zone republics under the Soviet Union, and they're stripped clean of their economy, basically, and it all goes towards Russia. So the whole thing, this all starts in Nuremberg, Germany. This whole thing actually that's where the Nazi power really gained traction. And in Nuremberg, that's where the laws against the Jewish population are signed. That's where Hitler's power base was. Well, it all ends in Nuremberg. So the Nuremberg war trials are conducted, and any Nazi officer that is left over after the war, including high officials like Hermann Göring, who's in charge of the German Luftwaffe, and the economic minister, are held for their crimes. Their treatment of some 11 million Holocaust victims, the 6 million that die. The Japanese are also held to account, and 720 of its leaders, its high leaders, are executed for crimes against humanity. Excuse me. Not so many of the Germans are actually tried as the Japanese. There's 720 Japanese. I don't even think they broke 100 with Germany, as shocking as that is. You can draw your own conclusions as to why that might be. Our failure to use the League of Nations last time is seen, and this time the Allies established themselves as the United Nations. The UN Charter is officially signed, and now we have this this conglomerate of countries that includes the Soviet Union, and they are, and these countries now are the political base of the world, and is there to prevent such conflicts from occurring again. So what does this look like for the future in post-war Europe? Well, London, Warsaw, Berlin, they suffered terrible destruction and need to be rebuilt. London and West Berlin are, for the most part. West Berlin, it gets the help it can get, but it's still in East Germany. So really, London and Frankfurt and Paris all get this money from the United States to rebuild. Agriculture has just been neglected this whole time and is displaced. France ends up getting huge subsidies from the United States, and then later, Europe as a whole. And now even in the EU, France gets about 40 or 50% of the agriculture subsidies to maintain its farms and wineries and all that kind of thing. Still going on today. There's a mass spread of famine and disease. There's large tracts of Europe that there's no food and there's no nothing. It's just people are starving and they're sick and they're dying. And it needs to be addressed as soon as possible for Europe's successful recovery. So there's no able-bodied men left to plant fields, to deal with this lack of food, to rebuild even. And winter is a bad time. This is a good depiction of what most of the cities are going to look like. Paris is, for the most part, saved on when the Germans invade because the Parisians, they leave. But on the way out, Paris is basically stripped clean by the Germans as they leave. They don't really do a lot of destruction, but it is stripped clean. And a lot of these, the French cities along the French-German border, and then the Belgian and Dutch and the Netherlands cities, they look like this. It's just sad. We looked at the Nuremberg trials just a little bit ago, but 23 nations that are there. They go on for about a year in Nuremberg, Germany. They're for the crimes against humanity. And then everyone that is found guilty is executed, and they're actually cremated at a concentration camp at Dachau, incidentally. That's what they do with their bodies. They load them up on trucks after they're hung and drive them down to Dachau and then cremate them. And then that's so their bodies are just gone to history. They don't get a memorial at all. So our League of Nations was supposed to be peacekeeping. It lasts from 1919 to 1946. It had 23 original members. The United Nations, same purpose, but it starts in 1945, and I think that number is 196 now, but 192 nations. There's actually most of the nations in the world are in the United Nations. There's 200 and something. I don't remember. So yeah, I think it's 196 now. League of Nations really, it's the cause for a lot of this, to be honest with you. League of Nations was nothing but a blame game. But the United Nations have promoted economic development and environmental protection, as well as prevented wars and saved people's lives. The UN Peacekeeper Corps deserves our commended applause for their efforts. Originally it's 48 nations to form this international peacekeeping body, of which they create a permanent Security Council where there's 11 members that that rotate, but 5 of them are permanent, and the 5 of them are still there: United States, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, France, and a newfound person on the world stage, China. I think you guys should get that. That's kind of World War II is where China goes from a market and exploitative area of Europe to now they're on the Security Council, and they're a world power just as much as the rest of them. The Security Council really is where most of the power is held within the UN, and it works for like if there's to be an intervention per se, like say it's like brought before the UN that hey, we wish to intervene in this civil war or to stop this war from occurring. The Security Council meets, the representatives that go there anyways, they meet, and they have to unanimously agree. Generally speaking, in modern terms, the Soviet Union and now Russia and then China are the ones to go together, and they'll veto what's going on with the five. And then Great Britain, France, and the United States generally vote together. The Soviet Union Eastern Bloc countries are, again, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia gets broke up, Eastern Germany, and Poland. And it's a buffer zone. Yugoslavia and Albania actually end up as kind of like it's a battleground area. Yugoslavia is half communist, half democratic, if you will. And there's a civil war going on there, and it ends up breaking up into multiple different countries. And you'll see that later in modern history with like places like Serbia and where else do we go? Forget. Anyways, yeah, it ends up being modern history is going to take place really heavily discussed with these countries in Europe, and then our former colonial acquisitions in Southeast Asia, Korea, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. Those are all. And then Africa really is going to be another point of contention. So the impact of Stalin and Stalinization of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. He ignores his agreement at Yalta, the Yalta Conference, to designate each country a communist government. He instead installs his puppet republics. Truman presses Stalin to live up to his agreement to FDR at the Yalta and to allow free elections in Eastern European countries, but Stalin refuses. He does what he wants. And so Europe is divided, and as Winston Churchill says, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central Europe, Central and Eastern Europe. All these famous cities and the populations around them lie in the Soviet sphere, and all are subject in one form or another, not only to Soviet influence, but to a very high increasing measure of control from Moscow. And old Winston is the bastion of democracy, if there ever was one, and what a speaker he was. Or is. What a speaker he is. So we have some division, and this Iron Curtain is a metaphorical wall in between East and West Europe. And this is where we see the rise of 007, right? So James Bond, this is his wheelhouse. It is a figure of speech, but it does present that there's no movement, no communication. And that goes back to our discussion about Pepsi having the 17th largest navy in the world for all of a week, and that's because the Soviet Union currency is not allowed to be used worldwide. It's Soviet only. They practice strict autarky. Remember that word, autarky? So they only trade within the Soviet Republic blocks. No need for anyone else. That's why this Iron Curtain works, because they're trying to keep everything in and keep everyone out. This occupation of Berlin ends up being a contentious area where the Allies divide Germany into 4 occupation zones, but then Berlin is divided, and we have to like airdrop supplies and deal with the contention of Berlin being divided. And most of the capital is occupied by the Soviet Union. The communist government renamed the German Democratic Republic, or the GDR. West Germany is occupied by the United States, France, and Britain, and they have become the Federal Republic of Germany. Today, I want to say they're called the Federal Republic of Germany today, within the unification. Maybe. See, this Berlin blockade becomes a big deal. It's between 1948 and 1949. It's Berlin's on the eastern side, and they begin to blockade and not allow anything in, and that's where we have to do this airlift thing, the Berlin airlift. So We didn't want to start an armed conflict with the Soviet Union because that's terrible. We just came out of World War II, plus it's the Soviet Union. And so we just began by dropping supplies down to the people of Berlin via German airplanes. And the Soviet reaction to the Berlin airlift, that Stalin declared that communism and capitalism could not coexist. And that began the Cold War, is what we're going to find out. There it is, the Cold War. So the bear, I wish that was an eagle and not Uncle Sam. The bear and eagle duke it out, not Uncle Sam. We'll do an eagle. Well, how does it impact Europe? Well, you guys get to list specific examples, apparently. I'll let you do that. You can pause, but there are things that happen. We talked about, think about Pepsi and the ships, right? There's no money movement between the Soviet Union and Western Europe and the United States. There's nothing but hatred between the two and suspicion, and it becomes a rivalry and a competition of technology, of social stance, of prowess, and things like the space race come out of this. Who can get to the moon first? Who can get to outer space first? Who can make better cars? Who can have better houses? Who can have a bigger and better military? Who can make more atomic weapons? That's what happens. A giant rivalry. So what happens is we get these alliances that are developed. We have the North Atlantic Trade Organization, or Treaty, or not trade, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, which is headed by the United States and Great Britain, and encompasses the countries listed below. That's a modern representation of them. They didn't look like, there weren't that many of them to start with. And then for the Soviet Union, you get the Warsaw Pact, which comes out of the Comintern, and it includes all those new Eastern Bloc nations along with the Soviet Union, which is already its own union. There aren't near as many of them as you'd think there'd be, but that's how it works. So NATO, because of this treaty, it's a military treaty as well as an economic treaty, and it's to provide mutual defense to Western Europe. And there are other treaties that occur within the NATO itself signs with Asia and the Pacific nations. And we see the expansion of the American military, our economic influence, and our diplomatic presence worldwide. And this is where we see all of those bases, those 320-something bases I was saying we had. The Warsaw Pact is more of a defensive setup, and it's the Soviet Union's response to NATO. And it's provided mutual defense for those Eastern Bloc countries that were just put into power. The Soviet influence begins to expand out, and there are countries that begin to have communist leanings, and things happen like the Greek Civil War, where the British inform the United States that they're no longer able to assist the Greeks in resisting the communist attempt to take control. So it instigates a proxy conflict between the British, the Democratic Republic of Greece, and then this communist, or these people wishing to have communist control. And this is going to happen over and over and over. And you're familiar with Korea and Vietnam to the United States. Those are the same thing. This comes out of Truman's new policy called the containment policy. It's a key foreign policy from the 1950s all the way up into 1991, where the U.S. and NATO pledged to protect the world from communist expansion. And we're going to do this through military force and economic aid to the countries that would otherwise be falling to communist influence. And you can see some that might have had that problem. So we put a lot of money into Japan. We were trying to help China. China does fall communist, obviously, because of modern history. You'd know that. Pakistan is still a contentious area today. Israel and Palestine, still a contentious area. Western Europe, we put tons and tons of money there, so it ends up staying as it is. And we're all aimed at the United States, or the USSR. This all comes out of, again, Thurgood Marshall is a Supreme Court justice. Oh, my Lord. Well, I hope you guys were laughing as I said that earlier. You can laugh now. George Marshall. That Marshall. Other Marshall. He's no longer the chief of staff. Now he's the Secretary of State under Truman during the 1950s, and he's got this. And Secretary of State is the foreign. You're in foreign policy. That's your job. You're the leader of foreign policy. So he has this European recovery program, and he's trying to use the economic means of doing things, not military. So yeah. We already talked about this. His major aims to prevent the spread of communism and destabilize the international political order. Um, 4 years in Congress, they appropriate $13.3 billion, and this is for 22 European nations. We help American business by opening up European markets and help stabilize European politics to resist the communist infiltration and the spread of communism in Western Europe. So, if you think a minute, the Marshall Plan was an attempt by the United States to combat communism by we use the military and whatnot. We use economic sanctions against communist countries. Think autarky, wouldn't have really worked. Economic aid to countries in Europe to make communism less attractive, or diplomatic sanctions against Soviet Union and other communist countries. Just take a minute on that one. Really, there is a military strength, right? Because the buildup of military arms, atomic weapons. Economic sanctions wouldn't have worked because the Soviet Union practices autarky and is trading within itself, so they could care less if we don't trade with them. Now, economic aid to countries in Europe to make communism less attractive. Now, that's a biggie. Because, right, we're putting all this money, $13.3 billion. And we're sending all this money to rebuild Western Europe. So that's definitely a good answer. Now, finally, diplomatic sanctions against Soviets and other communist countries in Europe. More like communist countries around the world. Like the embargo in Cuba, right? We stopped trading with Cuba, which has been a long-time trade partner when Fidel Castro takes over Cuba and makes it communist. And we didn't trade with them up until like President Obama. It took a long time to rethink that. So post-war, Japan get a ton of money from us. By the way, Japan gets so much money, and Tokyo and Hiroshima and Nagasaki are destroyed. General MacArthur is placed in charge of the U.S. Occupation there, and he wanted to ensure peace and prevent future war. So his goal was to demilitarize Japan, reduce their navy, their air force, and whatnot down to a security force, the Japanese Defense Force, the JDF is what it's called. And he wants it done quickly. He only allowed a small police force, and he held trials for war criminals. 7 out of 25 accused are sentenced to death by hanging, including Tojo, which was the prime minister, the head guy. He's in this picture here. He's the guy with headphones, second from the left of the military police guy in the middle of the picture. I know that's like a lot. But if you're looking at the guys in the rows of desks, not sitting at the table at the forefront of the picture, he's the guy sitting up with the microphone and the headphones and the funny looking glasses and mustache. That's Hideki Tojo. He's the architect of the entire Japanese imperial acquisition setup. Let's see here. So these reforms are that they broaden land ownership. Huge estates are sold to the government. The government then sold them to tenant farmers at a reasonable price, and increased participation in workers and farmers, creation of independent labor unions, all things that weren't there because it was imperial in Japan. So there was like there was kind of like a social order, if you will. Here's General MacArthur and Emperor Hirohito when they met, and they garner a great relationship. And Hirohito rules up until like 1989, 86, somewhere in there, I want to say. So they democratize Japan. This is the first time this happens. They develop a constitution. It's the most important achievement of the occupation. It's drafted by MacArthur and his staff. There's a thing called the Diet, or Diet. It's a Japanese two-house legislative body mirrored after our own. And it has a prime minister, head of the majority parliament at the time. Everyone's allowed to vote, men and women, over the age of 20. And there's a Bill of Rights made, all reflecting the same thing. Article 9 says that Japanese can no longer make war and only fight if attacked, hence the Japanese Defense Force. Nothing to mess with today, by the way. They've really beefed it up, but that's because of communist China. So our occupation lasts till 1952, and Japan continues to allow the U.S. military presence in Okinawa. There's a Marine Corps base there. There's a Naval Air Station base in Yokosuka, Japan. They're both under contention, and a lot of that is being moved to Australia. And so our bitter enemies become our allies, and a new peace process known as nation building becomes a foreign policy of the United States, and we still practice nation building today. So stop and think about it a minute. What role did Douglas MacArthur play in implementing Allied policies after World War II? Did he oversee the post-war occupation of Japan? Did he negotiate the founding of the State of Israel? Did he direct the political division of Germany? Or did he organize the Yalta and Potsdam conferences in Iran? Iran is in the Middle East. MacArthur stationed in Southeast Asia, to be clear. You hopefully picked that he oversaw the post-war occupation of Japan. A. Okay, I am done. Thank you for listening. And stay tuned for what assignments come with this.